I'm Anna Maria Horner. I am a fabric designer and a patchwork and sewing pattern designer. And one of my favorite things to build in patchwork is bouquets. And today I'm going to share with you some of the tips that I'm thinking about as I'm designing them, and also some techniques that I use to make them a little bit improvisational in style. One of the first bouquets that I ever built in patchwork is this little design that I call mod corsage. And this one I really planned out, and obviously I use lots of floral fabrics, and the very center design of the flower really helps show that that flower is a flower to the viewer. But it is really broken down to three main components, and that is the background, which is very tonal, even though there's lots of patchwork and seaming for interest. It's quite tonal and pale. And then I chose some obvious leaf and stem colors, and then some obvious flower heads. And some of those are just improv patchwork, some are little 9 patches. And even for some little thorny leaves, I chose to do just little half square triangles. So there's a whole lot, in addition to a few components of appliqué, that you can use from just traditional patchwork blocks that really kind of propel those floral elements together. So this design was really special, and I really enjoyed doing it, but I planned it a whole lot and decided to try it a little bit more large scale and improvisational. And so I did this other quilt that includes lots of vintage fabrics as well as some of my yarn dyed fabrics. And I decided to start this one with no plan, but you can see that there's some elements of Dresden designs, or the Dresden blades rather. I use them in full and in part to do different tulip shapes. Again, I use the half square triangles sort of in a row to create a sort of a thorny looking stalk. And I really enjoyed the process so much that I thought I would share with you some of the design considerations and techniques that I used when I created that larger scale piece. In fact, if you wanted to do something smaller scale and just really simple and straightforward, this pillow is a perfect example of taking just 2 different template shapes that are sort of teardrop or petal shaped and continuing it in repeat to create a really kind of contemporary design, all from a singular fabric, but I think it has a really cool look. So focusing on the background, again, whether you choose to do light or dark, making it pretty tonal is really helpful. When I do that, sometimes I just start with building patchwork without any thought. And this one, I just did stripes between 2 different colors. I have a selection of solids pulled here that are just sort of an interesting non-traditional palette for floral. So there's no real greens, but I've chosen to let this citrus sort of act like my stem and leaf. Chosen the pale for the background, and I keep extra scraps or strips nearby to help me build. You can see I've already decided to cut into this and just sort of improvisationally build what would be the stem. So all flowers start with a stem or a stalk, right? And so the way that I created that stem was just connecting a stem color and a background color together so that that stem stops at a point. And I can just lay it in these cuts that I made. And I made these cuts really arbitrarily. So you can start doing the patchwork process first before you start building in other appliqué. I'm going to take this stem and the background piece here over to the machine and go ahead and sew that together just with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And because this is cut on the bias, you do want to take a little care in how you put them together. So if pins help, you can certainly do that. And you want to take care that all your seams that you've already pressed are staying in place as you press them. And if you have any tails laying over the end of the patchwork in the end, it doesn't matter. This is something that you can continue to trim up and work on as you go. So it's really just as simple as that in terms of creating a patchwork background to do the stems. And so my next step would be to set this one in here and then put those together after you trimmed a straight line. So then I'm starting to build this stem and leaf work in the back. The other thing that I like to have on hand are just these little floral heads, if you will. This is really just a Dresden block in process. This is just a 9 patch, but the center of it has a different bright color that makes it feel a little bit floral. So lots of times I start this process with some orphan blocks, some things that I've made or tried out but are just sort of lying around the studio without any real purpose. I love using Dresden blocks because you can use them in half like fans or in quarters like tulips and do a lot of really interesting things with them. So again, just traditional patchwork provides lots of different floral elements. I also use bias a lot because that's a nice place to add a curve to make a leaf stem. That's a nice place to add a curve in your design instead of just all straight line piecing. And you could really cleverly actually just include bias right here in this seam when you go to structure the background and leave it loose. And then once it's already included in that seam, you could either machine applique it down later or applique it down by hand and get it curved and placed just how you want it. So it's really a combination of the two elements. And again, if you wanted to patchwork in this flower, say, you could chop up your background again, reuse some of your background strips to accommodate the size and work it in, rather than doing everything in applique afterwards. And then another thing that I like to do when I'm doing applique, if I'm choosing to do it raw edge, I'll just use some fusible on the back, some double-sided fusible on the back of my fabrics. I've got all these fabrics set up here and I've already got fusible on the back of them. And I love cutting out little organic shapes. So I've used my templates here to do that. This template would be something that I would use for needle turn applique because it has a seam allowance included, but this corresponding leaf shape doesn't have seam allowance included in the shape. So I use this just to trace on the back on this paper side and then cut it out. And then I can peel the paper off and set it in place. And the cool thing about that fusible is that you can actually press them in place as you're composing and kind of create your whole floral design before you go to sewing with the decorative stitch. And this Dresden plate needs a center. I think that I'm gonna use my circular shape to not just cut another solid fabric, but I'm gonna use this patchwork right here to cut a circle from. And it doesn't have fusible on the back of it, but it's not large scale. So I actually think that just tracing it here and cutting it out, and then using a decorative stitch on the machine to put it on the center of that Dresden will be really cool. There's no reason that you only have to use your printed fabrics or your solid fabrics as your stash. You can use your patchwork as your stash as well. So I'm just going to cut this out with small scissors. And using a decorative stitch that's got several needle positions across it, in other words, it's kind of wide, it's going to help to secure these seams that I'm cutting through right now. But if you wanted to put fusible on the back, like I have these solid fabrics here, before you even start cutting, that would definitely help secure the seams as well. But this is improv, baby, so I'm going for it. Is this little square in the center? I don't know. Doesn't really matter. Okay. I love how that looks. That's really cool. All right, so let's just take this to the machine and do a little decorative stitch to get it in place. When I do decorative stitching, especially on a circle, I like to keep my hands flat on both sides to keep everything smooth. And take your time. There. And I actually really enjoy that decorative stitch giving another element to the design. It's kind of creating some shadowing on the edge of that center. So be sure to look at everything that you got in your studio, even mid-progress works, as something that you can play with to build a beautiful floral applique quilt.